Have you ever noticed how fear has a way of quietly threading itself into every corner of our lives? Not always loud, not always obvious, but it's there. In the hesitation before speaking your truth, in the tightening of your chest before making a decision you can't undo, in the quiet conversations you have with yourself at night when the world falls silent and your mind grows loud. Fear isn't always a roaring monster. Sometimes it's a whisper. It says, what if you fail? What if they leave? What if you're not enough? For centuries, human beings have tried to outpace it. We've built walls, amassed fortunes, chased pleasures, sought validation. But fear has an ancient wisdom. It knows how to hide behind every desire, every attachment, every fleeting joy. And until you turn and face it, it will own you. I want to take you somewhere, beyond the constant noise of the world, beyond the glittering distractions and the relentless chase, to a quieter place where truth waits patiently for those bold enough to look within. Because the art of fearless living isn't about erasing fear. It's about understanding it, befriending it, and ultimately transcending it. Long before psychology named its syndromes, long before therapists gave fear 1,000 clinical labels, ancient wisdom traditions, especially Buddhism, understood its roots. They saw fear not as a flaw, but as a natural byproduct of craving and ignorance. Fear arises when we cling to what we can't keep, when we try to hold steady in a world that is forever shifting. The Buddha spoke of anicca, impermanence. Everything changes, every breath, every relationship, every circumstance. The moment you forget this, you suffer. Fear thrives in the illusion of permanence, in the false promise that if you could just control enough variables, lock down enough outcomes, you might finally feel safe. But there's no refuge in control. There's only refuge in clarity. And so, the calling to fearless living begins not with grand acts of bravery, but with a single act of honesty, the willingness to admit that you are afraid, not because you're weak, not because you've failed, but because you're human. And in that admission lies the doorway to something far greater than the fleeting safety you've been chasing. There's a story I once heard from a Zen teacher. A young man approached an old master and said, "I am tormented by fear. It follows me wherever I go. How do I defeat it?" The master smiled gently and replied, "Do not waste your life trying to defeat fear. Learn to walk beside it. Offer it tea. Listen to what it's trying to teach you." You see, fear isn't your enemy. It's a messenger. It signals where your attachments lie. It reveals the places you've mistaken the impermanent for the eternal. It marks the boundary lines between who you are and who you might become, if only you had the courage to cross them. And the truth is, you don't need to eliminate fear to live fearlessly. You need to stop letting it lead. Because the real art is not in becoming fearless, but in living so fully, so honestly, so compassionately, that fear has no power to stop you. It may ride along in the passenger seat, but it will no longer drive the car. Our modern world, though, conditions us differently. We're told to accumulate, to compete, to conquer. Fear is marketed as something to avoid, something to medicate, something to drown out with endless distractions. We numb ourselves with scrolling feeds, superficial conversations, and curated identities. But deep down, the quiet remains. The knowing remains. That something essential is missing. You were not born to live this way. Beneath the layers of conditioning, you possess an ancient clarity, a knowing that your deepest peace isn't found in perfection, but in presence. In the full-hearted embrace of life as it is, uncertain, impermanent, and breathtakingly alive. The Buddha called this state nirvana, not some mystical escape, but the extinguishing of the fires of craving, aversion, and delusion. And what remains in its place is a fearless heart, a heart that can witness suffering without collapsing, a heart that can experience loss without closing, a heart that can hold both joy and grief, knowing neither defines you. And so, this journey we begin together is not about learning some rigid doctrine. It's about remembering what you already know in your bones. It's about peeling away the noise until you can hear the still, small voice inside, the one that whispers, You are more than your fear. Along the way, you'll meet stories, ancient teachings, modern practices. You'll be asked to pause, to reflect, to breathe, to question the assumptions that have shaped your life until now. And you'll discover that fearless living isn't a distant mountaintop to be reached one day. It's 1,000 small choices you make every single day. It's speaking kindly when it would be easier to lash out. It's staying present with discomfort when every part of you wants to escape. It's showing up for someone else's pain, even when you haven't resolved your own. It's learning to say, "I don't know," and being at peace with that. Fearless living is a practice, not a destination. You will stumble, you will forget. Some days you'll feel consumed by anxiety or doubt, and that's not failure, that's part of it. Because every time you return to presence, every time you soften when you want to harden, every time you meet fear with curiosity instead of resistance, you are rewiring your soul. And over time, something extraordinary happens. The fears that once seemed so large, so heavy, so suffocating, begin to lose their grip. Not because life became easier, but because you became stronger. Not in the way the world defines strength, as domination or control, but in the way wisdom traditions have always known it. As tenderness, as openness, as trust in the vastness of life itself. And so this is your calling, not to chase fear away, not to armor your heart, but to live so honestly, so courageously that fear becomes irrelevant. Because there is a life waiting for you on the other side of all those what-ifs. A life where your days are not dictated by anxiety, but guided by wisdom. Where your worth is not measured by perfection, but by presence. And perhaps most beautiful of all, where your fear, instead of being your jailer, becomes your teacher. Let us begin. There's a question that haunts every human being, whether they realize it or not. Why am I afraid? Not in a passing, surface-level way. Not about the obvious fears, snakes, heights, public speaking, but the deeper ones. The ones that follow you like a shadow. The ones that shape your choices without your permission. The fear of being forgotten. The fear of not being enough. The fear of loss, of aging, of death. The fear of loving and not being loved in return. And unless you learn to trace fear back to its roots, you'll spend your life trimming branches that only grow back stronger. Because fear isn't random. It has a nature. It has causes. And if you can see those causes clearly, you can loosen fear's grip on your life. Buddhist wisdom, over 2 millennia old, has always taught that fear arises from 3 primary roots: ignorance, craving, and aversion. Ignorance isn't stupidity, it's forgetfulness, a forgetting of the true nature of life, a blindness to impermanence, to the reality that everything you see, touch, love, and cling to is destined to change. You see, we suffer because we expect the world to behave like a static painting when it is, in fact, a river, constantly moving, constantly dissolving. And in our refusal to accept this, we give birth to fear. We fear losing what we love. We fear confronting what we dislike. We fear the unknown because we've forgotten that life is the unknown, and ignorance feeds the other 2 roots. Craving is our desperate clinging to what feels pleasant, familiar, or safe. It's the way we chase after fleeting highs, hoping they'll anchor us in a sea of uncertainty. But no matter how tightly you hold a wave, it slips through your fingers. And every time we mistake the impermanent for permanent, we suffer. You get attached to a relationship, believing it will never change. You cling to youth, convinced you'll always look this way. You hoard wealth, imagining it will shield you from life's storms. But craving never delivers peace. It only amplifies fear, because deep down you know nothing you cling to can stay. And so you live in quiet terror of its loss. And where there's craving, there's always aversion. The instinct to push away what we find unpleasant, painful, or uncomfortable. But here's the great irony: what you resist persists. The more you reject fear, the more it tightens its grip. The more you avoid discomfort, the more it defines your life. You build your world around what feels safe, avoiding conversations, decisions, risks that might unsettle you. But this only shrinks your world. until you're left navigating a life so narrow it barely resembles living. The Buddha likened this to a man pierced by a poisoned arrow who, instead of pulling it out, wastes precious time asking what type of wood the shaft was made of, who crafted it, and why it was shot. We get so caught up in the stories surrounding our fears, we forget to address their cause. Fear arises because we mistake what's transient for permanent. We try to hold on to what is meant to pass, and we turn away from truths we don't wish to face. If you want to live fearlessly, you must learn to see fear not as the problem, but as a symptom, a message. It points to what you're still clinging to where you've forgotten the nature of things. A Zen story tells of a monk who crossed a river at dusk. Feeling something brush his leg, he recoiled in horror, believing it was a snake. All night he lay awake in fear. At dawn, he returned to find a length of rope floating in the water. The snake was never real. Only the mind made it so. And isn't this how most of our fears operate? We imagine worst-case scenarios. We project stories into an uncertain future. We assign meaning to every sensation, every glance, every silence. And these imagined fears shape our reality. We shrink from opportunities. We sabotage love. We cling to routine, even when it suffocates us, because we've mistaken the rope for a snake. Modern psychology confirms what ancient teachers knew: most fear isn't about the present moment. It's about imagined futures or past traumas projected forward. But the present itself, almost always survivable, almost always softer than our anticipation. And this is where wisdom begins. Not in eliminating fear, but in seeing it clearly. In asking, what am I truly afraid of? What am I unwilling to let go of? What truth am I refusing to face? Because every fear is tethered to something you believe must not change. But everything changes. And the more you resist this, the more fear will own you. The Buddha taught that freedom isn't found by controlling life, but by understanding it. By seeing the nature of fear as rooted in clinging. By recognizing that what we hold on to most tightly often causes us the most pain. And so, the path begins with awareness. Not dramatic gestures, not renouncing the world, but in noticing, in catching yourself in the act of clinging, in watching your aversions rise and fall, in witnessing your mind turn rope into snake. Each time you do, a little more light enters the room, and fear, like all things born of darkness, begins to dissolve in the presence of clear seeing. You begin to realize that what you feared most wasn't the thing itself, but your resistance to it. Not death, but the refusal to accept it. Not change, but your unwillingness to flow with it. And in that space between stimulus and response, between fears arising and your reaction, there lies your freedom. A freedom so quiet, so simple, it's easily missed. But it's there, in every breath, in every pause, in every choice to soften rather than harden, to stay rather than flee. And so, fearless living isn't a life without fear. It's a life where you've understood fear's causes so deeply that it no longer controls you. You walk beside it, but it no longer leads. You make decisions from clarity, not compulsion. You speak your truth not because you've conquered fear, but because you've befriended it. And perhaps most precious of all, you no longer need to believe every story your mind tells you. The rope is just a rope, and you, at last, are free. There's a quiet truth we often miss in our desperate search to escape fear. Fear doesn't need to be destroyed. It needs to be understood. Because the moment you turn toward it with eyes wide open, something extraordinary happens. It begins to unravel on its own. This is the heart of mindful transformation. Not a battle, but a witnessing. Not a fight, but a gentle, relentless seeing. In the ancient Buddhist texts, there's a powerful teaching called vipassana, insight meditation. A practice designed not to avoid fear, not to distract from it, but to sit with it. To observe it arise, swell, and eventually dissolve like every wave in the ocean. You see, fear feeds on your avoidance. The more you turn away, the larger it seems. The more you resist, the heavier it becomes. But when you bring your full awareness to it, not through force, but through curiosity, fear starts to lose its shape. It was never solid to begin with. It was always made of passing sensations, fleeting thoughts, old stories you never questioned. And mindfulness is the light that reveals this. But what exactly is mindfulness? It's one of those words that's been tossed around so much in modern culture, it risks becoming empty. But at its root, mindfulness means one thing: to see things as they are, without distortion, without commentary, without clinging or rejection. It's being fully here, not lost in regrets about the past, not swept away by anxieties about the future, but witnessing this moment exactly as it is. And when fear arises in this space of awareness, it's no longer an enemy. It's a messenger. It shows you where you're clinging. It reveals what you refuse to feel. It uncovers the beliefs you've carried without question. It invites you to stop running. The Buddha once said, "Pain is inevitable. Suffering is optional." Fear in its raw form is simply a wave of energy passing through the body, a quickened heartbeat, a tightening in the chest, a rush of heat. It's our story about fear that turns it into suffering. We feel anxiety and immediately label it. This is bad. This means something terrible is about to happen. I can't handle this. But what if you didn't add the story? What if you simply felt the sensation with no judgment? That's mindfulness. A Tibetan teacher once asked his students, "What's the fastest way to become fearless?" The answer wasn't courage. It wasn't positive thinking. It was familiarity. Because what you're familiar with can no longer frighten you in the same way. Mindfulness creates that familiarity. By repeatedly turning toward your fears, not to conquer them, but to know them, they begin to lose their edge. You learn their patterns. You recognize their voice. You see that they're often based on half-formed assumptions, exaggerated memories, or future projections that may never come to pass. And something miraculous happens when you see fear for what it truly is. It shrinks. Not because it's gone, but because you've stopped feeding it your resistance. In Buddhist practice, there's a teaching called the 5 hindrances, obstacles that cloud the mind and block wisdom. One of them is restlessness and worry, the constant agitation of fear in its subtle forms. And the antidote is always awareness, not to suppress it, not to replace it with forced positivity, but to watch it, to let it rise, to trace it back to its source, a thought, a memory, a belief you inherited but never examined. And you'll find that most fears, when exposed to the clear light of awareness, dissolve faster than you ever expected. It's like turning on a light in a room you've avoided for years, only to find the monster was never there. Just old clothes and forgotten furniture. But mindfulness isn't a one-time event. It's a discipline, a daily returning. It's choosing to pause in those moments when your heart races, when your stomach knots, when the mind floods with worst-case scenarios. It's saying, yes, this is fear, I see you, I feel you, but you are not me. Because the greatest trap of fear is identification, the belief that because you feel afraid, you are fear. But you are not your thoughts, you are not your sensations, you are the awareness in which they arise. The more you rest in this awareness, the less power fear holds over you. One of the most liberating practices in Buddhist tradition is metta bhavana, or loving-kindness meditation. And here's the surprising part, it's not just for others. You can extend loving-kindness to your own fear. Instead of rejecting it, you can meet it like an old friend who's lost its way. You can silently say, may this fear be held in compassion, may it soften, may it teach me, may it pass. Because when you hold fear with kindness, it transforms. It reveals the hurt, the longing, the tenderness hiding beneath its sharp edges. And often, what we label as fear is simply an unmet need for safety, for love, for belonging. Mindfulness brings you back to this truth. It reminds you that in this breath, in this moment, you are alive. You are safe enough. You are whole. No imagined future, no resurrected past, no catastrophic thought can touch you here. This is the sacred ground of now. And this is where transformation happens, not by force, not by dramatic epiphanies, but through the quiet, persistent act of noticing. Noticing when fear grips your throat, noticing when you want to run, noticing the stories you tell yourself in the dark, and choosing, even for a single breath, to stay, to feel it, to watch it, to let it move through you. Because every time you do, the roots of fear loosen a little more. And over time, you realize you don't have to eliminate fear to be free. You only have to stop letting it make your decisions. You can walk forward, heart pounding, knees trembling, and still live fully. Fearless not because fear is absent, but because you are no longer its captive. And that, in the end, is the art of mindful transformation. A return to yourself, to the quiet, steady presence that has always been waiting beneath the noise. Courage isn't what we think it is. It's not the absence of fear, nor is it the dramatic acts we see in movies or on the evening news. Real courage is quieter. It lives in small, almost invisible moments. In the instant you choose presence over avoidance. In the breath you take before speaking your truth. In the decision to stay open when every part of you wants to shut down. This is embodied courage. It's not an idea, it's a practice. It's how you meet your life, not as a battlefield to conquer, but as a living meditation. Every conversation, every challenge, every anxious thought is an opportunity to embody fearlessness. But here's the paradox. To live fearlessly, you have to be willing to feel fear. Not just once, not just when it's convenient, but every day in the 1,000 little ways life asks you to show up. When you speak up in a meeting, knowing your voice might tremble. When you admit you don't have all the answers. When you ask for help. When you say no. When you say yes to something that terrifies you because you know it matters. Courage isn't some heroic trait you either have or don't. It's a muscle. And like any muscle, it grows through use. But it doesn't grow in isolation. It deepens through embodied practice, through feeling fear fully in your body and choosing to act anyway. This is something ancient Buddhist teachers understood profoundly. In the monastery, monks aren't trained to avoid discomfort. They're taught to meet it, to notice the tightening in the gut, the rush of heat in the chest, the quivering breath. Because fear lives in the body. And the only way to release its grip is to stay with those sensations long enough to realize they won't kill you. You realize the story your mind tells is far more terrifying than the sensation itself. In Buddhist mindfulness training, there's a beautiful technique called noting. When fear arises, you simply name it. Fear, fear. When your heart races, racing, racing. When your stomach clenches, tightening, tightening. Not to judge it, not to fix it, but to see it clearly as it is. And by naming the experience, you create space around it. A breath, a pause, a chance to choose something different. That moment of choice is where embodied courage lives. And the more you practice it in small, daily ways, the more natural it becomes in the bigger moments. Because fearlessness isn't built in crisis. It's built in the ordinary. When you wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding from some imagined disaster, and you place your hand on your chest, whispering to yourself, "I'm here, I'm safe. This is just a feeling." When you walk into a difficult conversation and feel the tension in your shoulders, but you don't run, you soften, you stay. When you choose to tell the truth, even though it might cost you approval, each of these is a sacred act of courage. And here's something no one tells you. Courage feels a lot like vulnerability. In fact, they're twins. To live fearlessly is to live vulnerably, not recklessly, not impulsively, but openly, to let life touch you. To let fear rise not as an enemy but as a teacher. To feel it fully and still say yes to life. A Zen master once said, "The obstacle is the path." And when it comes to fear, that's more than a poetic idea, it's a practice. Whatever scares you holds the seed of your liberation. Not because fear disappears when you face it, but because you learn it never had the power you thought it did. When you live this way, courage stops being something you perform. It becomes something you inhabit. You start moving through the world with a kind of quiet steadiness, not because you never feel afraid, but because you trust yourself to hold fear and keep moving. There's an old teaching about the second arrow. The Buddha said, when we experience pain, it's like being struck by an arrow. That's unavoidable. But the suffering we add through our reaction, the story, the resistance, the shame, is like being struck by a second arrow. And that one's optional. Embodied courage is the wisdom to pull out that second arrow, to feel fear without the extra weight of judgment. It's choosing presence over performance, and presence by its nature is fearless. Because in this moment, not the imagined future, not the remembered past, fear has no hold. When you're fully here, breath by breath, fear is just another sensation. It passes, and you remain. A beautiful example of this comes from the Thai forest monks. They're known for meditating alone in jungles filled with tigers, cobras, and all manner of unknown threats. And when asked how they manage fear, their answer isn't bravado. It's presence. They don't pretend not to be afraid. They don't try to suppress it. They breathe into it. They feel it move through their body. They notice the stories the mind spins. And then they return to the simplicity of the present. A footstep, a leaf falling, the sound of their own heartbeat. And in doing so, they realize that most of what they feared was never out there. It was in here, in the mind's endless movie reel of catastrophe. When you practice this in daily life, in traffic, in tough conversations, in moments of loneliness or grief, you begin to feel the same thing. You realize fear is loud, but it's not solid. It rises, it falls, and you're still here. And from this steady place, you can live more boldly. You can take the risk, speak the truth, love fully, let go. Not because you're fearless in the way the world describes it, but because you've learned to carry your fear with tenderness. And that tenderness transforms everything. It turns fear from a cage into a companion. It reminds you that every time you feel afraid, you're on the edge of something real, something that matters. And if you stay breath by breath, step by trembling step, you'll find that courage isn't a state you achieve. It's a way you live. There's a truth about fear no one likes to admit. It lives not only in the quiet corners of our mind, but in the spaces between us, in every conversation where we withhold our truth, in every glance where we fear being misunderstood, in every embrace we hesitate to offer, worrying it might not be returned. Fear doesn't just separate us from ourselves, it fractures our relationships, because deep down we're all afraid of the same thing: to not be seen, to not be loved, to be abandoned, betrayed, or left behind. And yet, it's through our relationships that we most vividly experience what it means to live fearlessly, not by being invulnerable, but by choosing to show up messy, imperfect, honest, again and again. Fearless living in relationship begins with listening, not the kind of listening where you're already preparing your reply before the other person finishes speaking, but the kind of listening that holds space, that stays soft, that lets another's words land in the tender soil of your attention without rushing to fix, judge, or defend. This is a radical act, because it means being willing to hear what you don't want to hear, to feel what you don't want to feel. It means letting go of the need to control the outcome of a conversation. To listen fearlessly is to listen with your whole body, your heart open, your breath steady, your defenses down. The ancient Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh spoke of something called deep listening, a practice not of hearing words but of hearing suffering. When someone speaks to you, whether in anger, grief, or love, they're offering a window into their inner world. And fearless relationships are built when we're brave enough to step through that window, to say, "I'm here, I hear you. I may not understand it all, but I will not turn away." And then comes the next great act of courage, loving. Not the safe, tidy kind of love that only shows up when it's easy, but the kind that risks everything. The kind that says, "I choose to love you not because you make me feel good or because you agree with me, or because you stay exactly the way I want you to be. I choose to love you because you are a living being, carrying your own unseen wounds, your own tender hopes. And because to love is to remember that we belong to one another." Fearless love isn't about possession. It isn't about certainty. It's about presence. It asks us to love without guarantee, to open without assurance, to give without keeping score. And perhaps hardest of all, it asks us to let go, because every relationship we have, no matter how beautiful, is impermanent. People change, they leave, they hurt us, or they die. And if our love is built on attachment, on clinging to what we want them to be, it will break us. But if it's built on presence, on the willingness to cherish what is here while it's here, then even loss becomes a doorway to deeper courage. There's an old Zen saying, to love and let go, love and let go, love and let go, that is the greatest courage of all. And isn't that what life keeps asking of us? To love a child we know will grow up and move away. To love a friend knowing distance, time, and misunderstanding may one day wedge themselves between us. To love a partner aware that one day, either you or they will draw a final breath, and to do it anyway. Not because we're fearless in the traditional sense, but because we've accepted the nature of things. Because we realize that love is not meant to be a possession, it's meant to be a gift. And fearless relationships are those where both people are free. Free to be fully themselves, free to make mistakes, free to speak their truth without fear of punishment, free to leave knowing they are loved enough to stay if they choose. In Buddhist psychology, there's a beautiful teaching about the four immeasurables, four qualities said to be the heart of true, fearless connection. Loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, equanimity. Loving kindness is the wish for others to be happy. Compassion is the desire to ease their suffering. Sympathetic joy is the ability to delight in their happiness. And equanimity is the wisdom to hold it all, love, loss, closeness, separation, without clinging or aversion. These four qualities transform relationships from contracts of fear into spaces of liberation. When you listen with compassion, you dissolve defensiveness. When you love with kindness, you loosen the grip of control. When you celebrate another's joy, even when you lack your own, you soften envy. And when you hold it all with equanimity, you discover peace. A kind of peace that isn't dependent on how others behave. A peace that allows you to remain open, even when you've been hurt. That's not weakness. That's the highest form of strength. It takes enormous courage to love someone who may not love you back the way you hoped, to forgive someone who isn't sorry, to bless someone as they walk away. But that is the practice. To stay tender in a world that teaches hardness. To remain open in a world that rewards guardedness. And every time you do, you reclaim a piece of your fearless heart. Relationships are not the source of our suffering. Our attachments are. When we learn to release the story of how it should be and meet people as they are, imperfect, beautiful, fleeting, we become free. Not free from love, free in love. And that's where true fearlessness lies. Somewhere along the winding road of our lives, a quiet question begins to surface. Why am I here? Not in the casual, passing way we ask when we lose our keys or wake in a strange hotel room, but in the bone-deep, soul-stirring way that keeps us awake at night. What am I meant to do with this one fragile, flickering life? And perhaps more importantly, what will remain when I am gone? Fearless living isn't just about navigating our emotions or healing relationships. It's about daring to envision a life that stretches beyond personal comfort, beyond petty concerns, into something vast, unshakable, and deeply meaningful. It's about purpose, but purpose isn't what we've been told. It's not a job title, it's not a destination, it's not the number of followers, plaques, or polished resumes. Purpose is a direction, not a point on a map. It's a way of moving through the world, guided by what matters most to you, even when no one's watching, even when there's no guarantee of success. And it takes courage to live this way. Because once you hear the call of your deeper purpose, you can't unhear it. You can try to ignore it, drown it out with noise, stay busy chasing things you don't care about. But it waits, patiently, like a river carving stone. To live fearlessly is to stop running, to turn toward that question and answer it again and again with how you choose to live. And one of the most radical truths you'll discover is this: your life is not just about you. It's about how you serve, not necessarily through grand acts or public platforms, but through the daily, invisible ways you uplift, protect, and care for others. The Buddhist tradition teaches that the highest form of courage isn't found on the battlefield, but in the quiet commitment to ease the suffering of those around you. To live not as a solitary island, but as part of a vast, interconnected web. Every word you speak, every choice you make, every kindness you offer or withhold ripples outward in ways you cannot see. Fearless service isn't about martyrdom or self-erasure. It's about knowing you matter because everyone matters. It's about using your unique gifts, your voice, your hands, your heart, in ways that leave this world softer, wiser, more humane than you found it. And in doing so, you craft a legacy. Not necessarily the kind written in history books, but the kind etched in the hearts of those whose lives you quietly touched, the stranger whose burden you lightened, the child you taught to believe in themselves, the friend you stood beside when the rest of the world turned away. Fearless living asks us to think about what traces of ourselves we wish to leave behind. Is it bitterness, resentment, and regret? Or is it tenderness, wisdom, and light? Because one day, whether we're ready or not, we will leave this place. And when that moment comes, we won't measure our worth by what we accumulated or how perfectly we performed. We'll measure it by how bravely we lived, how deeply we loved, how courageously we served, how sincerely we stayed true to what mattered most. There's a story told in Buddhist monasteries of a teacher who asked his students, "If you had just one more day to live, what would you do?" Some answered, "I'd pray, I'd meditate, I'd seek enlightenment." Others said, "I'd find my loved ones, I'd tell them I love them, I'd make peace." The teacher smiled and said, "You should live every day as if that were true, because it is." Fearless vision means living with that clarity, not in morbid dread but in luminous awareness. It's a way of focusing on what truly matters and letting the rest fall away. It teaches us to ask not, "What can I get from this life?" but "What can I give?" Not "How can I win?" but "How can I contribute?" And perhaps most importantly, how can I live in a way that leaves no part of my heart unlived? The practice of fearless purpose isn't about fixing the world. It's about showing up fully in the corner of the world you touch, your home, your friendships, your work, your daily choices. It means waking each day and asking, how can I bring more clarity to this conversation, more kindness to this moment, more courage to this decision? It means refusing to let fear dictate the size of your life, refusing to shrink when the world tells you to play small, refusing to harden when life wounds you, refusing to live a half-hearted existence because you were too afraid to be fully seen. And when you live this way, with vision, with service, with intention, you become unshakable, because your peace is no longer tied to fleeting outcomes. You understand that storms will come, people will leave, plans will fail, but you are rooted in something deeper, a clarity no loss can steal, a love no failure can destroy, a purpose no ending can erase. And that is the ultimate freedom. As we reach this place in the journey where fear has been met, transformed, and outgrown, there's one final threshold to cross. A space where we turn to face the greatest unknown of all, the final letting go, the surrender of everything we thought we owned, every identity we clung to, every future we tried to control, not as a loss but as a return, a homecoming to what was always waiting within us. The last chapter is not an ending but an opening, and that's where we'll go next. And so here we are, at the threshold of something both ancient and entirely new. You've traveled through the tangled terrain of fear, faced its roots, witnessed its masks, and learned to hold it not as an enemy but as a sacred messenger. You've explored the stillness at the heart of mindful awareness. You've tasted the weightless courage of embodied presence. You've opened your heart to fearless love and unguarded connection. And you've glimpsed the quiet power of a life guided by purpose, service, and legacy. But if there's one truth this journey has revealed, it's this: there is no final destination. Fearless living is not a finish line you cross, a badge you earn, or a secret you finally unlock. It's a way of walking, a way of meeting each moment as it is with honesty, with tenderness, with a fierce, unshakable heart. It's about falling down and rising again, losing your way and remembering the path, forgetting who you are and finding yourself again in the smallest, most ordinary acts of courage. Fearless living isn't a life without fear. It's a life where fear no longer chooses for you, where you speak the difficult truth even when your voice shakes, where you love, knowing full well it might break you open, where you offer your gifts without guarantee of applause, where you let yourself be fully here for the grief, the beauty, the ache, and the awe. Because this life, this one fleeting, fragile, extraordinary life, it was never meant to be lived half asleep. It was meant to be felt, held, dared, and perhaps above all shared. There's an old Zen saying, when the student is ready, the teacher appears, and when the journey is understood, the traveler disappears. Meaning, the person you thought you were when you began this path isn't the one who walks it now. Something quieter has taken root in you, a deeper knowing, a clearer seeing, a steadier courage. And though the world will still shake, though fear will still visit, though losses will come, you now carry within you an anchor that nothing outside can take away. A home you can return to, breath by breath. So as you step forward from this moment, into your days, your choices, your uncertain tomorrows, remember this. You were made for this life, not to be ruled by fear, not to shrink or harden or hide, but to meet it all, the beauty and the brutality, with the full, radiant, unarmored truth of who you are. And in doing so, you give silent permission to others to do the same. This is how we change the world, not through perfect plans or sweeping revolutions, but through ordinary people choosing every day to live wide open, to listen, to serve, to speak, to forgive, to stay. You don't have to do it alone. And you don't have to have it all figured out. You just have to begin. And when you forget, begin again. Because the path was never out there somewhere. It was always under your feet. And before we part ways, if this journey has stirred something in you, if you felt a spark, a quiet courage, or a reminder of your own fierce heart, I invite you to stay connected. We're building a community of mindful, fearless seekers here. People unafraid to have real conversations about the things that matter most. So if you'd like to keep walking this path together, if you're hungry for more stories, teachings, and honest explorations of the art of fearless living, make sure to hit that subscribe button. Leave a comment below, share what chapter resonated most with you. And if you feel called, share this video with someone whose heart might need it today. Your presence here matters more than you know. And I'm deeply grateful you chose to walk this stretch of the road with me. Until we meet again, stay brave, stay kind, stay fully, beautifully alive.